The historical shift from open to closed communion. Hello, I'm Spencer Shaw with Thinking Theologically. This is yet another of our video articles. You can read the entire article or listen to the audio version on our website, thinkingtheologically.org. The historical shift from open to closed communion. Many discussions have been taking place recently over the question of open versus closed communion. Open communion is the practice of publicly inviting the unbaptized to take communion. This includes not merely unbelievers, but also children and those with low-functioning disabilities. Closed communion, then, is the opposite. It is closing the Lord's table to anyone not baptized into Christ. In modern churches of Christ, of which I'm a part, we practice a version of open communion, though most in my fellowship probably don't actually realize it. We typically allow anyone to walk into our worship services and take communion. No questions asked. While this is not quite publicly inviting the unbaptized to partake, it does open the door to such behavior, since we don't question whether a person is baptized before we allow them to pick up one of our communion pods. However, this practice of open communion is not evidenced among the early church, at least as it's shown and represented in the church fathers. Now, the church fathers are the influential Christian writers and leaders in the first few centuries of the church, generally beginning in the 2nd century and through perhaps the 4th century. And so, for example, the Didache says, "Let no one eat or drink of your Eucharist, but they who have been baptized into the name of the Lord. For concerning this also the Lord hath said, Give not that which is holy to the dogs." Justin Martyr says, "This food we call Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake except one who believes that the things we teach are true, and has received the washing for forgiveness of sins and rebirth, and who lives as Christ has handed down." And then Cyril of Jerusalem says that the Eucharist is the completion of the discipleship process where a person becomes a Christ bearer. Now, the reason I believe church history primarily reflects a closed table is because the table closed relatively early, by the end of the 1st century. Though I believe that the table began as a table open to all who would come and partake. So the Lord's Supper began as part of a common meal, and this was rooted in the fact that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper as a part of the Passover meal. This is evidenced by Paul's discussion of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34, which is actually our earliest account of the Lord's Supper. Paul says that the Corinthians are not truly eating the Lord's Supper because when they come together for this meal, a part of which would include sharing bread and wine to remember Jesus, they are divided. The rich are getting full and drunk while the poor are going hungry. You'll also notice that Paul's account of Jesus' institution says that Jesus gave the disciples the cup after supper. Paul makes sure to include that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper as part of a larger meal, mirroring the Corinthians' practice of the Lord's Supper as a part of this fellowship meal. I believe the Lord's Supper was open at this point in the church's life. We know that, at least at times, unbelievers were a part of early Christian gatherings. In 1 Corinthians 14, 22 through 25, Paul discusses the practice of tongues and prophecy within the church's gathering. He says that tongues are assigned for unbelievers, not for believers, while prophecy is assigned for believers and not for unbelievers. And this causes Paul to go on and say how he believes that the church should conduct itself during its regular meetings is crucial because Paul doesn't want an unbeliever to show up and think that they're just crazy. My point is that there was at least some expectation that both Paul and the Corinthians had that unbelievers would be a part of their gathering. Additionally, since unbelievers would sometimes be a part of the gathering needed to be understandable and impactful to unbelievers. That said, imagine how the Corinthian practice of the Lord's Supper might have looked. They gathered together, believers and unbelievers. As a part of this gathering, they share in a fellowship meal. In the middle of this meal, They pass around unleavened bread and wine and retell the story of Jesus. If this is a valid reconstruction, does it make sense that the unbelievers would be allowed to participate in the fellowship meal, but in the middle of the meal told that they are no longer allowed to eat and drink? Does it not make more sense that an unbeliever would be allowed to partake of the entire meal with the hope that their experience of the Lord's Supper and the telling of Jesus' story would convict them, just like Paul hopes the practice of prophecy will do? If Paul expected that unbelievers would be a part of the assembly, would he not have addressed them in his discussion of the Lord's Supper in chapter 11? What about children or a person with a low-functioning disability who has no need for baptism? Were they left out of the meal? Were they told to leave the meal? Or would they have been included in the entire meal? It seems to me most reasonable that everyone attending the meal would have been included in the entire meal. If this is the case, how does the table come to be closed by the time that we reach the 2nd century? When you move from the earliest account of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 to the second account in the Gospel of Mark 14:22 through 25, something interesting happens. Mark's account takes place during the Passover meal. The context of Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper doesn't really change between any of the accounts, but Mark does not mention the supper during his account of the Lord's Supper. The same thing is the case in the third gospel account, the third account in the Gospel of in the Gospel of Matthew 26 through 29. When you compare the language of 1 Corinthians 11, Mark, and Matthew, the overlap is what is called liturgical language. Liturgy simply means worship, so worship language. There appears to have been a common way of telling the story of Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper during the 1st century. This language likely became common because it was regularly recited during the early church's practice of the Lord's Supper. Therefore, this common language finds its way into all the New Testament accounts of the Lord's Supper. Therefore, it seems that the Lord's Supper began as part of a common meal, as evidenced in 1 Corinthians 11. However, over time, it became more of a formal practice as part of a formal worship setting. This is evidenced by the development of the common liturgical language and the lack of the mention of the supper in both Mark and Matthew. Mark and Matthew likely drop the language of the supper because their communities are no longer taking the Lord's Supper as part of a common meal. If this is the case, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to hypothesize that many of these communities had made the table closed, or at least it was no longer quite as open to unbelievers as it was no longer a part of this larger meal. One additional point needs to be added to this discussion. It appears that early on, Christian communities were relatively open, allowing the coming and going of unbelievers into their worship, into their gatherings, and to their tables. However, towards the end of the 1st century, Christians began to be persecuted. This persecution causes the communities to become more closed. They had to be somewhat weary of unbelievers. This was a part of the process of the church developing more liturgical and formal traditions that helped to contribute to the closing of the table. It is amid this context that our third gospel, the Gospel of Luke, was written. If you read Luke's gospel, it becomes evident that Luke has an affinity for Jesus' table fellowship. In Luke, Jesus is always eating or talking about food. Luke's table theme culminates in Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper. I believe Luke emphasizes Jesus' table fellowship because he believes the church has forgotten about it. You see, Luke knew and was taught at least something by Paul. You can even see this when you compare their versions of the Lord's Supper. There are some unique things that are found only in Luke's and Paul's versions. At least early on, Paul's communities emphasized the fellowship meal aspect of Jesus' ministry, the church's ministry, as well as the Lord's Supper. However, if it is true that by the time of Luke's writing, many communities were no longer practicing the Lord's Supper as part of a common meal, then Luke very possibly could have emphasized Jesus' table fellowship to fight against this. Luke even adds the reference to the supper back into the Lord's Supper account and heightens its connection to the Passover meal. I believe this shift from the Lord's Supper being a part of a common meal to a more formal worship setting is how the Lord's table moves from open to closed, and why, by the time we get to the 2nd century, it seems the general practice of the church was closed communion. I also believe this is why Luke emphasizes not only Jesus' table fellowship in general, but specifically his table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. Luke is arguing for an open table amid a context in which the table is beginning to close. Ultimately, the traditions that support a closed or semi-closed table went out, as evidenced by the practices in the 2nd century. However, Luke, and I believe Paul, would argue against using the traditions in Matthew and Mark to close the table to unbelievers.